Hi, this is Will Stewart from OnlineChessLessons.net, and I'm going to be looking at a game from the comeback kid, Francisco Vallejo, coming back in his native Spain on the return to Bilbao. He's really turned it around. In Sao Paulo, maybe it was the Portuguese throwing him off, I don't know, but he was getting pretty much slammed. But he's come back in round 6 and 7, getting a couple points and really catching up to the rest of the players in the Bilbao Super GM Chess Masters final. So Vallejo, he's opening up with c4 here, and he really needed some points. He needs some W's, because in this tournament it's 3 points for a win, 1 point for a draw, and if you lose you get nothing. So the wins are worth a little bit extra here. And that's why Ivanchuk has been leading the tournament, because he's been playing just some crazy aggressive chess. So Ivanchuk's playing the Grunfeld here, and Vallejo, the immediate h4. So he's got to get those points. So he's just going to open up here and really go after it and take Ivanchuk out of any theory. So h6, kind of, h5 was definitely possible. You don't really want to play bishop g7, because if you let the white pawn get to h5, this opening of the h file is certainly more beneficial for the white pieces. So h6, h5, maybe the drawback is that black wants to put his king on the king side. And by playing h5, you're giving white an easy avenue for attack, let's say with, a g4 advance later maybe. So it also surrenders the g5 square. So now h6, so if h5, black just answers with g5, no problem. So e4 by Vallejo. And so now we just, this h4 move maybe kind of looks a little bit silly to me, because white has surrendered bishop g4. But Vallejo strives to create, a double-edged counterplay. So bishop b5. And if bishop d7, I mean, the exchange of bishops would certainly favor white, and maybe he can just rook b1 or even a4. So instead, Ivanchuk, knight c6, and things are getting a little dicey. So d5, kind of some sketchy complications. Queen a5 certainly makes a lot of sense. And now rook b1. So this is very common in the Grunfeld. These there's not so much crazy tactics going on, but positionally it's very complicated, because if black stops to try to snatch, the a2 and c3 pawns are hanging, I mean, you just got to play really fast. So a6 is required here, not to lose a piece. And after a couple of exchanges, Vallejo castles, gets his king out of the center. So this is extremely unclear. But at first I was thinking the inclusion of h4 and h6 is going to favor black, because after bishop g4, this is uncomfortable. I mean, this is not so, Ivanchuk is playing aggressively here. And at this point in the game, both players already moved 13, has really started taking their time, and they're running a little bit low. The time control is not until the 40th move, where they'll receive another hour. So bishop g4 was pretty aggressive, but, if castles, it's tough to say. I mean, these pawns are hanging, but maybe just, taking here, and this is pretty inconvenient as well. Definitely be a pretty interesting position, but Ivanchuk strives for more, and pinning this knight, is pretty uncomfortable for white. But Vallejo comes up with d6. And so now rook d8, and it's, white e6, well, bishop f4. And now white has, got this little thorn in black's side here, and the pawn on d6 is very uncomfortable. If black castles, white's going to get the 2 rooks. Let's say bishop takes. He's got the 2 rooks for the queen. And with the easy access to the 8th rank, white should have a huge plus here. And the move h4 actually did help later down the road. So castling, not to be advised. Also possible, I looked at e5. And this is a serious mess. Maybe, just maybe, the move for white is going to be d7 immediately. With something like this in mind, this certainly seems to be pretty interesting. At the very least, white's going to be equal, I would think, at the end of the at the end of the big mess here. So maybe bishop e3 I also looked at, and bishop f8, and now d7. And let's say king e7, knight takes e5, based on a couple tactics. So white's got a lot of jokes here in any case. Even if he's going to be down a pawn, he's going to retain the initiative. So Ivanchuk just takes, and now bishop takes d6, and black's king is all of a sudden, it's a little bit lonely in the center here. So bishop f8, e5 natural, just reinforcing, pushing forward, and now castles. So this is not the easiest position in the world to evaluate. Maybe black, dynamically in balance for sure. I mean, white's got the pawn here. These double pawns aren't really doing anything. So it's kind of like white is up a pawn almost with that pawn on d6. But black's queen has got some pressure, although it's slightly out of play. Black's got this pin here. But if white, queen d2, just eyeing this little h6 pawn here. So Ivanchuk doubles the pawns. So now it's extremely difficult to evaluate. But here, Vallejo, it's like he's up a pawn, kind of. Because these double c pawns, are really only worth one pawn, the pawn on d6. So now he just snatches h6. Ivanchuk snatches a pawn, gets his queen back in play. That was pretty important. And now queen f4. So a nice centralizing move, and also taking these squares away from the black queen. c4, maybe this was like not the best move, but it's pretty tough to recommend anything else. And maybe with c4, he's thinking queen a3, trying to pick up that pawn at d6, because right now it's kind of tough. And h5, a nice move by Vallejo. He's running real low on time, just trying to soften up the black king side. So rook b6, maintaining this pawn here. This pawn's not a serious problem. c3, rook takes, and this is under control. The rook is covering that. White would have a pretty good plus, as well as the a6 pressure there. So rook b6, nice move. Rook c8, Ivanchuk's struggling, and now h6. So this maybe was Ivanchuk's, maybe this is a problem, with queen g7, is now the black queen is kind of embarrassed. He doesn't have a really good square to go to. Queen c3, again, this pawn is so weak here. And rook d4. So excellent centralization and coordination by Vallejo. And maybe, I'm thinking maybe queen a5 was possible here. But I don't know if it accomplishes a ton, maybe just rook b2. And maybe this allows kind of a restructuring of the white rooks. Queen a5, I thought it was interesting, though, just to try to push this back. I really think this would have been a better chance for Ivanchuk. Just to push the rook back. And if rook, rook b1, then the a2 pawn is hanging. And if rook b2 just as in the game, he throws on this check. But at least this rook, is definitely better placed on b6. So a little subtlety there. Instead, he throws on the check to reroute the queen. And now the rook, obviously you can see it's much more active. Starts gobbling up a few pawns. I mean, they were in, they had about a minute and a half each. So this is definitely not the easiest position in the world. So Ivanchuk proceeded with c3, trying to jettison this pawn here and create a diversion for white, trying to deflect him from the defense of d6. And so now I think Ivanchuk, in this ending, and he said after the game in a press conference, he thought this should be drawn, and I think it should be as well. I think maybe the move here seems to be c5 to me, to freeze this pawn so that the rook also is going to be frozen with its defense here. And it seems to be a drawn endgame. Even though white's got the extra pawn, these doubled pawns are weak, and his king is very far away from supporting that extra pawn. So that seemed to be the idea for defense. Instead, in extreme time pressure, like 20 seconds left, Vallejo had about 40. Instead, he captures the h6 pawn, which, if you're looking at this position, honestly, the h6 pawn is the last thing you got to worry about. You got to just only worry about the a pawn and stopping it in its tracks. So that's why c5, just stop it. The rook is going to be along the 5th, so it's going to be tough to activate the rook even more. So instead, taking the pawn, and now it's much different because this rook is behind the pawn now. And this is way different because when the rook's behind the pawn, especially as the pawn is going to be reaching the 7th rank here, now the rook can activate on the 6th rank behind the pawn, just tying the black rook down. So that's the problem with it. In these types of endgames, you don't want to chase the easy pawn, like the pawn on h6 a couple of moves ago. You want to make sure, that pawn's not going anywhere. So just, kind of forget about it. Focus on what's more important because that pawn is not such a serious threat. It's much more important to stop the A pawn because now, as we're seeing, black has a permanent problem there that he can't fix. White's just got this rook. Black's rook is tied down. White's just going to march his king over. No problem. It's very, very easy to win. And also controlling the 6th rank, pushing black's king back, and now it's just over because in this position, Ivanchuk just went ahead and played takes. He captured on a7. I mean, no matter what he does, the game's over. If he moves one of these pawns, white's just going to take. And however black captures the A pawn, white's just going to force a trade. So rook takes. It's the same thing. White's going to force a trade, come over and snatch this pawn. And with the 2 pawns, it's going to be pretty easy to promote. A couple extra tempos and stuff in the king ending there. So Ivanchuk just took, and he just resigned here because he's going to drop one of these pawns. And white's king, he's already got the opposition here on c6. The game's just over in the pawn endgame. So, a pretty nasty game by Mr. Vallejo-Pons coming back to Spain. This was round 7, so he's trying to make a push to catch the leaders with a couple wins late. So, it'll be nice. He's playing some very, very attacking, very aggressive chess, so it'd be nice to see him put some more pressure on the leaders. So, this is Will Stewart from OnlineChessLessons.net, and thanks for tuning in.